introduce our speaker, let me just briefly introduce this event in Mandarin for a while for the high school student over here. 这个谢谢大家来参与今天的这个 symposium。这个是唐奖基金会所支持的一个女性永续发展科学周。唐奖基金会呢是尹衍良，刚刚大家看的这个 video 是尹衍良先生所捐助的，他是希望是像唐人的诺贝尔奖这样子。那在这个其中有一个奖项是永续科学奖。那2年前呢 ，Brundtland 女士她获得第1届的永续科学奖。那她也拿到奖金之后，她也非常 generous， 她也非常慷慨，她有捐了一部分出来想回馈给台湾，所以她就是委托了成大的苏慧珍校长来帮她办一系列的，以后呢，在几年之内会办一系列的永续女性永续发展科学周这一类的活动。那欢迎大家来参加这个第1届的女性永续发展科学周。Well, this is the second plenary speech of the Brundtland Week. The theme is Women in Sustainable Development. Our speaker is Professor Nancy Lewis. She is a pioneer female scientist in sustainability science. She got all her degrees from University of California, Berkeley. She got her bachelor's degree in psychology, and she got her 2 master degrees, one in Department of Geography, the other one is in Department of Health and Medical Science. And later, she got her PhD degree in geography. As you can know, her training, her background is interdisciplinary. And yesterday, we were talking about capacity building, cross-disciplinary work, engaged society. Professor Nancy has done all of that. She currently is the director of the research program in the famous East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii. She's also the emeritus professor of the University of Hawaii. She's currently the president of the Pacific Science Association, that is a long-term famous interdisciplinary association around Asian Pacific area. And I'm sure she's going to introduce some activity later on. Professor Lewis's work led to a publication in World Health Organization in 2004, synthesis workshop on health impact of climate variability and climate change in small island states. So that's really a very good accomplishment of all the hard work she has done. And without further ado, let's welcome Professor Nancy Lewis.
I'm not sure if I heard aloha from the audience or some giggles. Aloha, as many of you may know, is welcome. It's also hello, and it's also goodbye in the indigenous language of where I come from, Hawaii. So I'm going to say aloha again, and I'd like you to say aloha back to me. Aloha. Aloha. Much better, much better. I'm exceptionally pleased today to have so many students in the audience taking your valuable time to come to listen to my talk. And I'm particularly pleased that I decided to make it less of it is very much a scientific talk, but there's another story too that I'm weaving through it, so I will share that with you. I direct the research program at the East-West Center in Honolulu. We were founded 65 years ago to enhance the relationship between the nations and governments of Asia, the Pacific, and the United States. We're an education, research, and outreach organization. We are a private educational NGO, although we do receive core funding from the United States government. And before I start my serious talk, I want to give a plug for a meeting that is going to be held in June at the Academia Sinica in Taipei, which is the 23rd Pacific Science Congress. It's the Congress that's held every 4 years by the Pacific Science Association, which is a regional science organization representing the governments of all the nations, or many of the nations of the Asia-Pacific Rim, as well as the islands in the Pacific Ocean. And Academia Sinica is a member, and they are hosting this meeting in June, Science for Sustainable Development at Power Club. The main congress is Science, Technology, and Innovation, Building Sustainable Future in Asia and the Pacific, and we're having a particular symposium on Science for Sustainable Development, Empowering Women in the Global Challenge. So for those of you who are in Taipei, we invite you to attend that as well, because we would like to have lots of students there. The journey to sustainable development. Does gender matter? I've actually changed the official title of my talk. Originally, when I submitted it, the subtitle was a gender responsive approach. And I thought that sounded rather bureaucratic, and it did not really represent what I wanted to talk about. Some of you may recognize the woman in the orange pantsuit in the center of this picture. That is Hillary Clinton. She was then Secretary of State of the United States. And she was at the Pacific Islands Forum in the Cook Islands, which is one of the countries in the Pacific Islands. And she was there to promote women's empowerment, a commitment by the government of the United States, as well as New Zealand and Australia. And the woman on the far side of the picture is Ambassador Amanda Ellis. She is New Zealand's ambassador to the European Union, as well as Francophone Africa. I'm very proud to say that she's an East-West Center graduate. She's an economist. She's worked for the World Bank. She's worked in the private banking sector, and she's served in the Foreign Service of New Zealand. And we have the great good fortune at the East-West Center to have her joining us for 2 years, starting in March, on a secondment from the Foreign Service of New Zealand to work on women's empowerment. And the woman standing next to Hillary Clinton is a good friend of mine, Adi Tufanagai, who's an incredible entrepreneur. She's Samoan. She started a business in Samoa that empowers women in Samoan communities, producing very high quality coconut oil. And she is a major supplier for the Body Shop, if those of you know the Body Shop who sell cosmetics. And at one time, I think she was the only supplier of coconut oil to the Body Shop, and she's wonderful. We do programs, which I'll mention, for young Pacific leaders, and we often have her come and work with us on those. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, the journey to sustainable development. But I'm going to do that. I'm going to set the stage, and this is probably because for many years I was a geography professor and taught world regional geography. I'm going to have a few slides that talk about the world we inhabit, the Asia Pacific, and some of its largest sustainable development challenges. I'm then going to talk about the journey of women in science in Asia and the Pacific. I'm then going to talk about the role of women as agents of change in sustainable development. But I'm going to frame all this in the worldwide journey of the Polynesian Voyaging Society canoe, Hokulea. And that worldwide voyage is termed Malama Honua, caring for the earth. And I had no idea when I put this talk together that I would be standing right next to the hull of an indigenous Taiwanese voyaging canoe. So that's special to me and exciting. And then I'm going to bring you full circle and introduce you to some of the women of the Hokulea. The Hokulea was first built in 1975 and made its maiden voyage in 1976, traveling from Hawaii to the Polynesian island of Tahiti. It sails under the auspices of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, and it has sailed on 11 long-distance voyages since 1976, covering over 150,000 miles. But through much effort of people in Hawaii and around the world, it has now embarked on a 47,000-mile voyage around the world. It sailed through the Pacific to Bali, to India, to South Africa. Now it has left South Africa and landed in Brazil, and it's right now on its way to the U.S. Virgin Islands in the United States. It's something that's very exciting to those of us in the Pacific, and it's been very exciting to those around the world. And what's special about the Hokulea and the Polynesian Voyaging Society is that the focus of this entire effort is really on sustainability and education. And there's a very strong interaction with students throughout Hawaii and the Pacific Islands, and you can follow the voyage on the World Wide Web. I can give you a link, and there's an intensive educational component to what we're doing, and we're very excited about it. And I'll return to this at the end of the picture. I'm a long-term member of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, and I've become involved in the sustainability legacy of this voyage, and we call it the Worldwide Voyage, which is particularly salient because the International Union for the Conservation of Nature is holding its World Conservation Conference in Hawaii in September, and this is all included in the efforts of the World Conservation Conference. And one of the reasons I chose to frame my talk in the context of the Worldwide Voyage here in Taiwan was because of the very strong Austronesian links between the indigenous populations of Taiwan and the Polynesian populations. And as I said, I had no idea I would be standing on a stage with a canoe. It's likely that Polynesian migration originated from people identical to the Aboriginal Taiwanese, and modern Austronesians originated out of Taiwan probably between 3000 and 1000 BCE. The photo of ribbon on the lower right is an Ami from the east coast of Taiwan, and the east coast Amis may be most closely related to the Maoris of New Zealand. And in this particular picture, she was on a visit to New Zealand to meet with her Maori cousins. And this is just a picture of Taiwan and the Polynesian triangle. You can see Taiwan there at the top, Aotearoa or New Zealand, Rapa Nui or Easter Island, and Hawaii in the north. And that's a picture of a moai, or one of the big Easter Island statues that I took about 20 years ago. I've been doing this a long time. And before I continue with the two journeys I want to talk about, I just wanted to mention the fact that the East-West Center has very strong ties to Taiwan. We work with the Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in Honolulu very closely, and we have a program funded by the Taiwanese government for young and mid-career Pacific Island leaders. They come to Hawaii for about a month and then spend about a month in Taiwan. And here's a picture of them, many in their traditional dress, with President Mao last year. And again, a slight digression before I continue with the talk. What I want to do is to congratulate the spectacular Brundtland awardees. I was amazed when I read your bios, and I was very enlightened and heartened, because sometimes the story about sustainable development and even the story about women in science can be sort of depressing. But when I read the bios of these young women, I was totally optimistic. And I have if there are many more like you, I have no problems thinking about the future. And I was even more impressed having the opportunity to meet all of you. So I'm really pleased I can be with you this week. Now to the context. Half of the world's population lives in Asia, and it's a region that is aging, it's urbanizing, it's warming, and although I don't focus on this in the talk, it's a part of the world that over the last several decades, particularly East and Southeast Asia, but increasingly South Asia, has also gone tremendous economic restructuring and economic growth. And there's been a very significant decrease in the number of people living in Asia under $1.50 a day, which is the UN standard for extreme poverty. Increasing life expectancy contributes to population aging, but the real cause of the population aging that we're seeing in many parts of the world, including East Asia, now Southeast Asia, many parts of Europe, is fertility decline. To replace a population, a nation's population, the fertility rate, which is the number of children the average woman bears, is 2.2. And you can see here in India, even Indonesia, China, and Singapore, the replacement level is or soon will be well lower than 2.2. The statistics for Korea, 1.2, Japan, 1.4. Japan's rate has actually increased a little bit, and here in Taiwan, only 1.1. So there's a real significant problem in many parts of the world with respect to low fertility. This has major implications in terms of labor supply, impact on the economies, care and health and costs for the elderly, the tax base, so it's one of the real issues that we need to deal with, and I'll return to this a little bit later. Another characteristic of not only Asia, but the globe is urbanization, very rapidly growing urban populations in much of Asia, and 13 of the world's megacities, of which there are 23, are in Asia. This presents challenges for sustainable development, especially in the developing countries, with sprawling peri-urbanization and squatter settlements. It's also an issue not only in the megacities, but for secondary cities, smaller cities, that don't have the wealth and power of national capitals. And there are issues related to infrastructure, transportation, energy, housing, health, and education. And one of the new Sustainable Development Goals that I'm going to talk about, Sustainable Development Goal 11, is focused on cities, and is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And at the East-West Center, we have a new program on urban governance that is just starting. Another phenomenon that is going to affect our sustainable development challenges is climate change. I'm sure you're all aware of issues related to climate change. The findings of the 5th Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the big body internationally that looks at this, suggested that global warming is likely to exceed 2 degrees Celsius, the threshold beyond which scientists think global warming will start to cause serious changes to the planet. However, a historic agreement was reached last December at COP21, Conference of the Parties. That's the meeting held by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and I got that out without stumbling. And 195 nations adopted what they call the Paris Agreement, which was under the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, where states agreed to keep warming under 2 degrees Celsius, the key number, and hopefully to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius limit or outcome. And this agreement, or this aspiration to keep climate change to 1.5 degrees wasn't expected before the meeting. So it was really a plus that came out of the Paris Agreement and suggests that there is a serious attention to this global problem. However, and before this meeting, 185 countries, representing 95% of the current global emissions of carbon dioxide, pledged to lower their emissions to reach a 2-degree cap. And that was great, except that if you actually scientifically go in and analyze those pledges by all of those countries, we're not going to limit it to 2.0 degrees. It's much closer to a 3-degree world, or even higher. So the pledges are great, but we've got to do more than that. A changing climate in Asia will compound the stresses of urbanization, industrialization, and economic development, and have significant infrastructure impacts. Warming trends have increased over most of Asia in the past century, and there's variation in precipitation in trends by region and area. And one of the real issues for much of Asia, particularly South Asia, but other parts of Asia as well, is water scarcity. And this is exacerbated by an increasing demand as well as a lack of good water management. I certainly do not have to tell this audience that Asia is one of the most disaster-prone parts of the world. You were at the epicenter of an earthquake 2 weeks ago, and my condolences to all of you here in Tainan. In the part of the world in which I work, we're still experiencing a very severe Cyclone Winston, which is the strongest cyclone ever experienced in the southern hemisphere, and is second only to Typhoon Haiyan that hit the Philippines 2 years ago. And it was almost a direct hit on the island of Fiji. And if any of you have been watching the news, it's really quite significant. I'm sure the death count, the fatalities, are not all in. But what's amazing is that so far they've only recorded 6 fatalities, which with an event like that, a disaster like that, is amazing. Asia experienced 70% of the world's natural disasters, and according to a recent Asian Development Bank study, is more likely to be affected by natural disasters than 4 times more likely to be affected by natural disasters than Africa, and 25 times more likely to be affected by natural disasters than Europe or North America. In Asia, 80% of the disasters are meteorological, climatological, or hydrological. Although here on the Pacific Rim of Fire, which is a very geologically active zone, earthquakes often cause significantly more damage in terms of loss of life and infrastructure when they do occur. I'm not going to go into this at any length. I put it up here for a reason I'll share in a moment. But one of the projects that we work on at the East-West Center is climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction for resilient societies. And many of the cities that are affected by disasters are in low-lying coastal areas where climate change and sea level rise is going to have very significant impacts. And this is a project that we have many partners on, but one of the partners on this project is actually the Taiwan government, has been the Taiwan government. I'm going to start now with the first journey that I wanted to talk about, and this is the journey of women in science in Asia and the Pacific. I've been long interested in promoting women in science in Asia and the Pacific, although this isn't my own research area. I don't do primary research on this topic, but this is something I have been advocating for a couple of decades. So because of that, and because I've been sort of away from this topic for a few years, I pulled up some recent studies on women in science in Asia and the Pacific. The first one was sponsored by the Association of Academies and Societies of Sciences in Asia, as well as the Korean Academy of Science and Technology. There was another one by UNESCO and the Korean Women's Development Institute. And the third one I looked at was by the Women in Science and Technology Association, whose executive director and key author was Sophia Heyer. These studies cover some of the same countries and not others. The data is not strictly comparable, and I'm just going to give you a sense as to what some of the issues are. One of the real problems that trying to understand where women are in the scientific enterprise is that the data isn't very good. And it's interestingly particularly bad in the United States, for reasons I can't really explain. Why is this important? As we face the challenge of achieving the new Sustainable Development Agenda, we cannot ignore the human resource potential of half of humanity. The very strong equity and human rights arguments for enhancing women's participation in science, but that's another talk, and I'd be happy to have that conversation after this, of course. But from a more pragmatic perspective, we need women's capabilities, their experiences, their perspective, and their numbers to face the challenges we are going to see in the future. And I'll give you some statistics about women in science here in Asia and the Pacific in a moment. But basically, to reiterate, there's the equitable treatment of all human beings based on human and civil rights. Women globally make up only about 35% of the science, technology, energy, and here in Taiwan, medicine. STEM sometimes means science, technology, energy, and mathematics, workforce, and it's less than that in Asia. We need all of our human resource capacity to address the sustainable development challenges. Women and men working together make better decisions with respect to sustainability and also advance the scientific understanding further. And a public will argument can also be made for needing an informed and scientific, literally global citizenry to address these challenges. So, in the first study I mentioned, this represents the leaky, what they call the leaky pipeline. And it may be difficult to see. The blue bar in the bar chart represents students in Bachelor of Science degrees. The orange bar represents students in PhD programs, and the green bar represents individuals actually in the workforce. And you can see that while there are, in some cases, more than 50% of women in bachelor's degrees, there are definitely, and in Australia, 51% in PhD programs, there are definitely fewer as one goes into the actual scientific workforce. And in a few minutes, I'll give you some reasons for, some of the things that are causing this, if not reasons for this. And this is a particular problem, in this study at least, in Australia, Bangladesh, India, Japan, and Korea. In Korea, the undergraduates in science, women, represent 41% and 37% of the PhDs. But when you get into the scientific workforce, only 17% of the professional scientific workforce in Korea is female. There are two exceptions for this, and partial exceptions to this. These statistics reoccur in most of the studies that cover these countries. And these are Philippines, where 52% of the workforce is scientific workforce is female, and Malaysia, where 49% of the scientific workforce is female. And this is true even in engineering and technology. Part of the reason in the Philippines is a policy reason. There is a very strong institutionalization of women's empowerment in the Philippines in the mid-1970s. There are other reasons as well, but I can't, and I don't know the situation in Malaysia, so I can't really describe that. And this is the study by the WIGSAT group. I'm not going to go into the specifics. It's basically showing the same thing. And the leaky pipeline falls continuously from secondary school in most countries to universities, to labs, professorships, and decision-making positions with respect to the direction and funding of science. And one of the conclusions from this study, and I think this is important because there are assumptions that are sometimes made, is that the gender knowledge divide exists and flourishes in all countries, even those with a highly developed knowledge economy. And gender barriers to STI, that's STI refers to science, technology, and innovation, will not improve automatically with gross domestic product, increased education, or increased internet availability. Assumptions have been made that as countries develop and they get more innovation, more technology, that this problem is going to go away. But the problem doesn't go away with those advances. Okay. Why do we have these leaky pipelines? Glass ceilings. The term glass ceiling refers to the, in science and technology, but other educational and employment venues as well, is that women can go so far up the ladder professionally that hit a glass ceiling, and few go further. And sticky floors refers more to the fact that there are cultural factors, structural factors that are keeping women from advancing professionally and achieving the same roles that men do in both the scientific workforce and elsewhere. There are reasons of culture, patriarchal societies, and perceptions about women in science. There's still a differential access to education in some countries, although this is becoming much less, certainly at the primary and secondary levels. Very importantly is a lack of role models, with few women in leadership positions in science, although I must admit, here at this university, with the visionary President Sue, that's certainly not the case. And I'm sure she's a role model for all of us. The culture of the workplace, as well as the whole issue of work-life balance, bearing and rearing children, who's responsible for the household activities. And in the next couple of slides, I went through this, giving even more examples in the educational, within education, as well as within the workforce. This is just a few more examples of what some of the factors are that are responsible for this difference in the scientific enterprise. So what's needed? We need gender-responsive action from governments, both policies and their implementation. We need a better coordination between ministries. We need further data disaggregated by sex. This is sometimes referred to as measure what you treasure. We need gender-responsive curricula and learning materials. We need more equipment and resources. We need role models in gender-responsive career counseling, support programs and initiatives for female science professionals, and we also need the serious involvement of the private sector. And gender needs to be taken into account when making policies with respect to attraction, the recruitment, the promotion, and retention at key points along the career path. I couldn't find too much about women in science in Taiwan in English in the literature. And I'm really looking forward to the symposium we're going to have in June, because hopefully I will learn more about it then. But there was one article by Lin Tan Cheng from Kaohsiung, in the Kaohsiung Journal of Medical Science, and she basically points to the same thing. And came up with a set of recommendations for implementation of programs to promote women science professionals. But in one of the very important components of this is societal perceptions of women in science and women's roles in science. And that's not only by the science establishment and by society as a whole, it's women's perceptions of themselves and what their possibilities are within the scientific enterprise. There are many, many, many international organizations that promote women in science. Some have been around for a long time. Some are newer. I think we can add the Grow Brundtland Week event to the activities. They're promoting internationally women in science, and that is exciting. And I'm going to finish with a quote from a book, The Door and the Dream. It was actually written a long time ago. It was written in 2000. And it's a book about women in the U.S. National Academy of Science. And one way people measure how effectively women are entering the scientific enterprise is how many women are members of your National Academy of Science. In this case, it would be Academia Sinica, and I don't know that number. I do know the number in the United States is only 10%, which is not very good. But this was by Rita Colwell, actually a friend of mine who was she's a professor now at Johns Hopkins in the University of Maryland. She's an environmental microbiologist. She has many honorary degrees, and she was president of our U.S. National Science Foundation. So to quote Rita, intelligence is not linked to the Y chromosome. To exclude half the populations from scientific inquiry is to deny us, as a nation, an extraordinary amount of ability and intelligence. The need for scientific brainpower will only increase as we proceed into an information age in which science and education will touch our lives like never before, and we've entered that age. Add to that the demands of global competition, and it's clear that to prosper in the 21st century will require the broadest scientific contribution possible. The cost of excluding any group is simply too high. And as we move to face the sustainable development challenges, and that's the second journey I'm going to talk about quickly, because I want to get to the framing of this, we need all of our talent to face the challenges we address. This is journey number 2, the journey to sustainable development, and the global community may be at the cusp of a new understanding of the relationship between science, sustainability, and human security. 3 years ago in Rio at the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development, provided a blueprint for global change research and a document, The Future We Want. And this is Future Earth, a new 10-year international architecture for global change research. But 2015 was a real watershed year in terms of UN agreements that are related to our sustainable future. 17 sustainable development goals, and these sustainable development goals are replacing the 8 Millennium Development Goals that were announced in the 2000 Development Agenda. We've made great progress on the 8 Millennium Development Goals in terms of reducing extreme poverty, in terms of women's equality in primary and secondary education, and on a number of other development indices. However, this Millennium Development Goals were really the United Nations attempt to foster development in the less developed countries. And what's really exciting about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they're truly universal goals. These are goals agreed upon for the entire world. So it's no longer the developed world and the less developed worlds, but these are truly universal goals, and I think that's probably the most exciting part about them. And an overarching goal is to tackle extreme poverty by addressing the issues of economic development in a way that's both socially just and environmentally sustainable. There's criticism of these goals, and I'm not going to spend much time on that. There's 17 of them, and some people say there's 17 silos. We're never going to be able to address all 17 goals, and there were special interest groups that were engaged in thinking about this and creating this. I agree, I think there are problems with the Sustainable Development Goals, but the fact that the United Nations accepted them, the fact that there's a global momentum to address the Sustainable Development Challenge, I think is very, very exciting. And there is a specific goal for addressing gender challenges, which is goal number 5. And I'm certainly not going to stand here. I'm sure you're happy to know and read all those goals. The women's, in all of these UN negotiations, there are what are called major groups, typically 8 major groups, basically reflecting special interests. In this case, women, but it could be NGOs, it's farmers and fishermen, it's indigenous people. And what this reflects is that at the time that the Millennium Development Goals were announced in 2000, a process had led up to that. There had been a number of international meetings that were addressing development for several decades before 2000. But then in a very short period of time, a group of about 10 people at the United Nations, including one woman, came up with the Millennium Development Goals. And there was immense public dismay at that they just sort of popped up, and that's what the world was going to do for the next 15 years. And in fact, we're now talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. The 7th goal in the Millennium Development Goals was focusing on the environment, but they originally only had 6 goals, and at the very last minute added the environment. So there's a big change between what happened, the way it happened 20 years ago, and what happened today. But because of that, the UN responded by creating these major groups and having many, literally thousands of consultations to come up with Sustainable Development Goals. So while it's problematic, it was a much, much more inclusive process, and consequently, there's more buy-in. But many of the activist groups said we didn't go far enough, and that's true of the women's major group. They have 8 red flags, and they reflect an absence of strong human rights statements, the fact that sexual and reproductive health targets don't go far enough, and a number of other criticisms. But it's still an amazing accomplishment, and very exciting. I'm running out of time. I really don't want to talk more than an hour, so I'm going to shorten this section of the talk. And in much of the literature and in a lot of the efforts, women's role in sustainable development, and the examples I'm most familiar with are in climate change and in disaster risk reduction, because those are the worlds I work in, see women as poor, vulnerable women from the global south. And that is a pervasive view, despite 2 or 3 decades of efforts by the United Nations, UNFPA, United Nations Development Program, and many academics of trying to change that view, to look at women as agents of change. And the example I will use are two of the assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Climate Climate Change, one in 2007 and one in 2013. And the one in 2007 was talking about vulnerability and assessment with respect to climate change. It was almost 1,000 pages long. In those 1,000 pages, there were only 5 references to either women or gender. 4 of those talked about poor, vulnerable women in the South who were going to drown or starve. I'm being a little facetious there, but that was the view. And one wasn't, and in fact, I wrote that box, but which was looking at women as more as agents of change. In 2013, the next assessment report from the climate group, there were more references to gender, maybe about 25, and there was a cross-cutting chapter on gender. It was about 4 pages long, but it still typically referred to women in impoverished situation and women's vulnerability. So that's a view we need to change, and we're getting there, and I'll get there in a moment. And this is just I'll run through these quickly, several slides of international and UN organizations that have been promoting women as agents of change for, in some cases, 3 or 4 decades. The Women's Environment Development Organization has been around forever. The Association for Women's Rights and Development is also an old organization. This is a newer organization based in the US, but international. Vital Voices Global Partnership. And I'm not going to read the titles of these, but these are all relatively recent, in the last 5 or 6 years, that represent largely UN or United Nations Fund for Population Activity or the United Nations Development Program, women sort of how-to manuals to promote women as agents of change in the development arena. Women are vulnerable, and this I will spend a little bit of time on. Women and men have different vulnerabilities to challenges, as well as different adaptive capacities. Gender, along with age, wealth, class, caste, and disability, do interact to shape the experience of development, often with increased vulnerability for women who make up 70% of the world's poor. In 2004, in the Indian Ocean tsunami, 70% of those that were killed in the tsunami were women. Yet with the great Japanese earthquake in 2011, the fatality rate, the number of people who died, was almost equal. The daily activity patterns of women and men are in part responsible for differences in risk. Women's caretaker roles may lead them to differential risk. There are also other issues related to culture that act to put women at a disadvantage. If their contexts outside the home are limited, their ability to respond to warnings may be limited as well. On the other hand, men, as first responders, the first to respond to the disaster perhaps, men as heads of the household, face different risks and different patterns of mortality. And there are a number of other cultural factors that put women at risk, but also enable them to be agents of change, and we can talk about some of those in the discussion period. Getting to the women as agents of change component, women have time and again been shown to be highly resilient and play very important family and community roles with respect to sustainable development. Women are critical agents of social change. Their understanding of social networks and community resources, as well as their life experiences, have much to contribute to sustainable development. With respect to disasters, women's community groups are often very involved in a crisis period. But after that, women are typically not the key decision makers, nor are they the prime recipients of assistance. However, if adaptation interventions are actually targeted at women to provide credit, specialized training, or appropriate technologies, these interventions themselves can be important tools for gender empowerment and community resilience. This is a publication that was released at the Paris Climate Change Meeting, Roots for the Future. It's for those of you that are interested in gender and climate change, it's a great resource, and I strongly encourage it. But the final chapter gives 35 examples, and I'm not going to go through those examples. The final chapter gives 35 examples of how effective interventions for women and dealing with climate change can bring both women's empowerment and very important community development. So that's a really good resource. And when I'm talking about sustainability and development, when I'm talking about women in science, that covers the entire spectrum. It covers the spectrum from women's indigenous knowledge, very grassroots knowledge. And that picture on the left was from a Pacific Science Intercongress that we held in Fiji about 15 years ago, where we had a very active engagement of many of the local indigenous knowledge groups in Fiji, providing information on traditional herbs, on effective cook stoves, effective rural development, but it also means women at the highest level of the scientific enterprise. And I'm not saying that those two of my Samoan graduate students, they're at the highest level of the scientific enterprise yet, but they both have their PhDs from the University of Hawaii in geography. So when I talk about science, I don't always mean just the highest levels in the lab, but what women know in the village, or what women know in indigenous biotechnology kinds of activities. And women's, I'm talking about women in science. Obviously, there are many other ways that it's important with respect to empowering women economically, and empowering women politically. With respect to empowering women politically, I'm just going to show these slides. And this is women members, this is women in international negotiations. These are the climate negotiations. And I have at the top members of national delegations, and at the bottom, heads of national delegations. And you can see that at most, women make up about 35% of the members of the delegation. And sorry, you can't read it. This is from 2008 to 2014. And even a lower percentage of women as heads of delegations. And if you were to break down these statistics by country, you would find that it's even lower in Asia and Pacific. The highest in Europe and Eastern Europe, and lowest in Asia and Pacific. This is the head of United Nations Women. It's the organization at the United Nations that looks at gender. Dr. Phumzile Mlambo. She's a former vice president of South Africa. She was the vice president of South Africa during the breakup of apartheid. She's an incredible woman. She's an incredible visionary. I had the opportunity of meeting her in November at a women's leadership conference. I have a quote from her about the new Sustainable Development Goals, which she hails as the most important effort of the United Nations since the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. I'm going to skip the quote, so we'll have time for a discussion. But now I get into the end of the talk, and I'm going to make a digression, which will explain why I'm excited about the canoe on the stage. When I did my doctoral dissertation, I have been on the Hokulea. I've never gone on a voyage on the Hokulea. But when I did my doctoral dissertation way back in the dark ages, I did it after having built a boat and sailing it around the Pacific for 2.5 years with my husband and my son, who was 6 when we left. So it's possible to have a family and also become a scientist. What I was studying was ciguatera. Ciguatera is a marine biotoxin that builds up in the food chain, in the marine food chain, and it doesn't affect the fish very much, but it can cause serious human illness and death. And it's very common in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, and some parts of the Indian Ocean. Fulbright was kind enough to support me for this effort, which was pretty exciting. My doctoral committee never thought I would return. We were sure I could sail off into the sunset. We have no satellite navigation. I mean, a Hokulea doesn't even use a sextant or a radio. They navigate totally by traditional methods. We did have a sextant and a radio, but that was it. And our longest voyage was from San Francisco to the northern part of French Polynesia, and it took 30 days. I'm excited about the voyage of the Hokulea. It goes way back in my own personal history. Again, the voyage of the Hokulea. There's the Hokulea. That's her worldwide voyage. She's about halfway through, as I said, navigating entirely by traditional means. The double hulls are 60 feet long. They have 12 crew members on board at any one time. For all the Hokulea voyages, there are about 300 crew members. This is on the first leg of the worldwide voyage, and this is landfall in Papeete in French Polynesia. This is Nainoa Thompson and Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General. Nainoa Thompson is the president of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, and he was the first navigator and continues to navigate often, but sails as captain more largely of the Hokulea. When the Polynesian Voyaging Society was formed, the Hawaiians had forgotten how to navigate. There were no Hawaiians who still knew how to navigate, so they brought Mau Piala, a navigator from Satawal, which is an island in Micronesia, to Hawaii, and he trained Nainoa, who continues to train a series of traditional navigators. So this is science. This is real science. Mathematics, physics, and the Hokulea sailed into the harbor at Apia during the small island, Apia is in Samoa, during the Small Islands Development States meeting in 2014, and I was lucky enough to be there, see it sail in. We were doing a Young Pacific Islands Leaders Program in association with this big UN program. Here are several women of the Hokulea, early crew members. When the Hokulea first sailed to Tahiti, there were no women aboard. But on the second voyage, there were, and that was Suzette Haoli Smith-Bergler. Chen Shel Ching is a crew member from 2005. And this is my favorite picture. This is again Nainoa Thompson, and he is there with an apprentice navigator, Linda Ferruto, just as they made landfall in Tahiti. I showed you a picture of the landfall in Tahiti. Well, Linda is an amazing woman. She was born and raised in a rural community in Hawaii. I believe she's the first first person in her immediate family to go to university. And she had a really hard time with math when she was going to undergrad in grammar school. So she decided to get her degrees at University of Mathematics, and she got a PhD in mathematics and is now a specialist at the University of Hawaii, an associate professor in the Department of Education doing math education. She's also the education specialist for the Polynesian Voyaging Society and the official liaison between the University of Hawaii and the Hokulea voyage. And she is incredibly inspiring and special. And I got to know her better because I wanted to do this in the talk, and so we've become close friends. So that's a special gift to me from preparing this particular talk. This may seem strange. Some of you may recognize the gentleman on the left-hand side of the picture for you. That's President Obama. Actually, President Obama's mother was a graduate student at the East-West Center, and he grew up playing in we have a Japanese garden behind the building that I showed you in the first picture, and he grew up playing in the Japanese garden. And the other two gentlemen there, with the one with the hat and the other, are the hosts of a program on the Discovery Channel called Mythbusters. And I don't watch it that often, but they're Jamie Hyneman and Adam Savage, the Mythbusters. And this is on the occasion last August of Astronomy Night at the U.S. Capitol. It was on the West Lawn of the U.S. Capitol. I think it was the third Astronomy Night. And this is where they bring all sorts of scientists and astronauts and all sorts of people to the Capitol in Washington, D.C. with school students, with younger children and also high school students, to get them excited about astronomy and to get them excited about science. So if this works, I'm going to show, in one moment, I'm going to show you a 3-minute video. And it's a video of another apprentice astronomer, Jenny Ashidi, from the Hokulea, and Sunita Williams, who's a NASA astronaut, who's been on 2 6-month voyages to in space, one on the US Space Shuttle, and the other on the Russian Soyuz space shuttle. She's now part of their commercial crew. And this I call navigating across ocean and space, and hopefully this will work. And then, yeah. This is a discussion with the two.
This is Hokulea. This is a voyaging canoe from Polynesia, from Hawaii, and we're sailing around the world. And currently we're in South Africa. We just reached South Africa today.
Today?
Yeah.
And sailing across thousands of miles of open ocean.
Yes, and using traditional Polynesian voyaging techniques.
And Polynesians had really elaborate, extremely exacting star charts to navigate by.
They just use in their minds, they memorize the universe, and they look at nature for answers, and that's what we're trying to continue and perpetuate.
So it's empirical knowledge that they're using to travel incredible distances across the ocean.
Exactly, and we're sailing around island Earth looking for solutions to the world's greatest challenges.
Yeah, the Polynesian navigation I find really inspiring. They went to Hawaii, they went to New Zealand. I mean, their breadth around the planet from their home base is astonishing when you actually start to draw the circles.
So largest, I think, nation on Earth, when you look at it, in all the water that they discovered using these techniques, they were scientists and mathematicians.
And so this boat just landed on South Africa yesterday or today.
Yep, her name is Hokulea, and she just touched Richards Bay, and we're going to be in Cape Town in November for the arrival ceremony.
How many people are crewing the boat?
There's 12 at a time, and about 300 crew members from all over the Pacific and international crew members as well.
You, Jamie, actually used to be a boat captain in the Bahamas back in his 20s.
Wow.
Navigation is it's pretty scary when you think about it. With any of these kinds of things, taking off. I mean, it's not like you park the boat for the night, you know, and you don't know what's out there, and you run into something in the middle of the night, and you're whizzing along like a rock in the middle of the water.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, it's sort of a shot in the dark that literally and figuratively that you're dealing with. So it's almost like jumping off a cliff and hoping you land in the water.
And you have a really good crew on board always looking out for you, probably just like the space.
Well, Sunita, you're part of the commercial crews for NASA, working with Boeing and SpaceX. This is a totally new branch of this is a totally new branch of astronautics. Is it not?
Absolutely. So I think what's different about it is we're sort of, we gave list requirements to these companies and said, hey, we need a spacecraft that will leave planet Earth and go to the space station. So take advantage of all the technology that we've advanced in the last 2-3 decades and put it in that spacecraft. And then we as this group of 4 have flown in space, both on the space shuttle and on the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. And so we're using that experience and going to the companies and
and seeing sort of what they've done and comparing it to what we've done in the past.
And you're giving them advice and
well, sometimes they tell us, okay, enough, but, you know, just using our experience to say where are the problems that we ran into before, and maybe we can anticipate some of the problems that they might have, and help them solve some problems.
And so it's this must be it's obviously a very radically different experience than just working on spaceships that are designed by NASA.
Absolutely, because we're involved in the design process, so that's pretty cool. So we get to sort of shape it a little bit as much as we can, and like I said, solve some problems. So the Polynesians, we're able to solve some problems together. And the teams are huge. You know, it's our NASA teams as well as both of those companies' teams getting together and trying to solve this.
And you guys are going to are you going to pilot these? You're going to go up to space in these devices?
Yes, we are. So that's going to be a lot of fun. But I got a lot of faith and trust in the companies. You know, of course, they want to do this successfully. We all want them to do this successfully. Our spouses, my dog even wants them to do it successfully. So I think they will. They'll do a good job.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, it's
very
pretty cool.
exciting
It's
time.
pretty neat.
What is the projection for the first flight?
So I'm contracted since 2017, so knock on wood, that's when we'll be starting to fly. So a little bit after you guys probably finish your journey around the world.
Is that your goal to travel all the way around the world?
Yep, 2017, so we'll be coming home.
Awesome.
So we'll track you guys.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yes. Awesome.
I think we should be sailing in to perhaps
So I'm sorry the audio on that wasn't great, but at least you got the sense that there was a young woman navigator from the Hokulea and a female astronaut that's part of our NASA crew who's been to space twice and will be going again in 2017. So 2 women scientists. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Nancy, for this very interesting talk. Just let me briefly say something in Mandarin. 所以我大致上先介绍一下那个 Nancy 刚刚大概，她其实是以女性科学家的角度，但是她刚刚整个 presentation 其实是介绍了整个永续的概念的发展，从20多年前一直到现在，联合国有一个永续发展的一个目标，然后我们怎么样这个向目标前进 ，OK， 这整个过程中，然后也讲了一些女性科学家的角色。那她在刚开始之前的时候，介绍一下他们用传统方法做的一个，也算是也不算是独木舟啊，但是一个叫什么舟？反正有10几个人可以在上面，就是用人力的方式，用传统的方式来操作 ，OK。那到刚开始，当然可以想见以前的话，大概都是。这个男性在操作这些，那在影片的最后结束的时候，他特别介绍这个影片是中间不只是那个航海家有女性的参与，而且是在这个上太空的这个 spaceship 的话都有女性科学家参与。他从这个来做结，就是把整个永续科学的发展以及女性科学家在这里面的角色做一些介绍。OK， 所以大致上介绍一下。那所以大家待会如果有问题的话，尽量发问。那我也是希望说，这个同学们，如果你们不太能够以英文发问的话，你们可以用中文发问，然后我们想办法翻译。OK， 好，可以用这样的方式来增加大家的参与。那因为这个是女性的这个永续发展科学周，所以我们特别从国外也请了5位的这个young female scientists。OK， 所以那我们这个的plenary 的设计是希望由这个 plenary talk 先结束之后，我们请这个5位女性科学家先发言，讲一下他们的 comment， 然后之后的话再开放给大家提问。OK，so now I'm going to invite each of these 5 young scientists we invite overseas and then give us some comments or thoughts one by one. Why don't you come upstairs, come here and then yes. Please, yeah? Yes.
Okay, thank you very much to Professor Luis for his pretty spiritual speech about the gender issue and the sustainable development. I really appreciate it as being a woman with the scientists, big scientists, not only scientists, but big scientists. So this is a big opportunity to integrate the scientific knowledge between the developing and developed countries as well, because she taught in her speech that women and empowering in every sector like economy, political, and also science, pure science, that is they are servicing in the Navy sector. But my question is that in the perspective of developing countries, it is very challenging issue, you know very well. So nowadays, they are increasing the number of empowering political, economical sector as well. But what is your suggestion about the scientific knowledge or scientific enrollment in this sector? Would be very helpful for the developing countries, because it is almost still now it is very challenging for the cultural and the social perspective of developing countries. So what is your suggestion? How can we improve to involve ourselves with the scientific involvement for the global perspective? So this is asking to me what is your suggestion?
Well, I don't have an easy solution. You have identified the problem. I talked about the glass ceiling, which exists throughout the world. In India, there's very high enrollment. I don't know about Bangladesh, but in India, there's a very high enrollment of women, over 50% in science programs, but it rapidly falls off after the degree to early career to higher career to decision making. I mean, one of the reasons it's important to have women in the highest levels is because they make the decisions about funding, they make the decisions about research priorities. So I think we all have to work together as a global community to try to address that. And I do think one of the things that's important is to get government ministries to work across ministries, not just the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Development, and other relevant ministries to really get this in the eyes of the policymakers. Because quite frankly, we need all of human resources to solve these problems. Thanks so much for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy, for very interesting talk. And before I share my comments, that it's not comments, it's kind of my experience that I want to answer as a question to Nancy. Because you have been a female scientist for a long time, what is the most impressive, or what is the most impressive experience you have being a female or being a woman in your career? What is the most things that is surprise to you that's gender imbalance? Because yesterday we talked about this. Yeah, so I would like to know about this.
I don't think I can single out one experience. When I was hired at the University of Hawaii as a geography professor, I was the only woman in the department for 8 years, and so that was a challenge. But the women in other departments sort of came together and mentored me. I didn't talk very much about it in my presentation. I mentioned role models, but mentorship, I think the very most important thing is both having a mentor and being a mentor. So the one thing that I would really focus on is that.
Thank you. Before I share my experience, that I think that I want to introduce myself. My name is Jajin Chen. I'm Taiwanese, but now I'm working in the University of Tokyo in Japan. And Today Nancy is talking about some of the projects from UN, and I would like to share one of experience. I was a postdoc fellow UNUIS, United Nations University Advanced Study Institute in Yokohama. It was almost 8 years ago. And with that program, I think I take that advantage being a female, because with that fellowship, they say that they need 2 female fellows, and I am one of them to be selected, especially from developing countries. So I think that for UN projects, that some of the opportunity is open for the female scientists from developing countries. So I agree that some of the projects has been promoted for the female scientists for the sustainable development. And the second thing that I want to share is that for sustainability sciences or sustainable development, women play a very important role, especially for developing countries. Last year, I brought students to Kenya. We went to the slum. Now we call informal settlement, and we have an interview with various households, and we found that female with the household, they play a very important role to keep the house and also to maintain environment, especially for sanitation or water management. So I do agree that being a woman or being a housewife, that female play a very important role for the sustainable development, especially for developing countries, because apart from that for the maintain the environment, but they also play a very important role for take care of the children, the next generation. This kind of things that I share. Thank you.
Peter, let's go ahead. And please introduce yourself a little bit before your question.
Hello, I'm Kafila Siddiqa from Bangladesh, from International Center for Diarrheal Disease Research. So thank you very much for your really exciting and interesting presentation. It was very comprehensive. So I would really like to know about what will be the key factors for female researchers in developing countries to become successful in a male-dominated research environment. So what's your suggestion?
Well, I have two sort of off the top of my head suggestions. One is to be persistent, and one is to keep your good humor. I mean, and there are times when you just wonder, and I think, maintaining your professionalism is always important, but you have to push yourself forward. With respect and not being culturally inappropriate, but you have to be firm, and when you really think something is not right, you have to speak up in a respectful way and to the right people, but you need to do it. And it's not always easy, but it's important. I think that's key.
Also, another point you mentioned that mentorship is very important, being a mentor and being mentored. But we find difficulties in such an environment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there are several issues here, and it's particularly difficult, I think, in developing parts of the world. Men can be very good mentors. They may be hard to find. And women are not always good mentors. I mean, there's that side of the coin as well. So you have to be careful in the mentor you choose.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I would like to translate this into Mandarin. I think it's really important. 我想要就是用中文讲一下，因为我想会对这个年轻学者非常重要。就是他的问题是说，怎么样在这个女性科学家怎么样在男性主导的这个科学界能够一展头角？那 Nancy 给了2个重要，他说要至少有2个 suggestion。第一个的话，你要 persistent， 就是要非常应该是说持续坚持你的自己的看法。如果说你觉得什么事情是对的，什么事情是应该这样做的，你要很应该说 gracefully 很优雅的要讲出来。OK， 要讲出来，而且要继续这个做到。 第二个的话，我觉得很有趣，就是说他说要维持一个good humor，就是说要有幽默感。他说，因为有的时候你其实你只能一笑置之，但是一笑置之之后，你还是要去呈现你的这个说法，然后所以让人家了解你。所以语气并不是要去塞的，你应该要把你自己觉得该讲的话讲，但是要有一个比较。应该是幽默的方式，一个比较graceful、比较优雅的方式让它呈现出来。这个是给大家做这个参考。好，再一个我想再讲，就是说，刚刚 Nancy 有讲了一个，就是说，他觉得这叫 mentoring system 很重要。对我们来讲 ，mentoring 应该可以翻成良师益友，就是比我们 senior， 但是可以当我们好朋友，可以带领我们在这 career 发展上的。那 Nancy 有提到，就是说，很多的 mentor。对女性来讲，不见得一定是不见得一定是女性科学家可以当我们的 role model， 或是这个很好的 mentoring。有的时候男性科学家也可以当我们的 mentor，OK， 当我们的良师益友。所以的话，那女性科学家有的时候反而不见得是很好的良师益友。所以这个也预祝大家在career上可以找到比较好的良师。
Thank you very much, Nancy, for such an interesting presentation. My name is Bushra Khalid, and I'm working as a postdoctoral researcher in International Center for Climate and Environment Sciences, Chinese Academy of Sciences, China. So I can understand, as you say, that you were the only female while you were pursuing your PhD. I can understand because I was also the only girl in my class when I was pursuing my master's and even PhD, and I faced a lot of difficulties as well. At the same time, I also found very good colleagues who helped me to reach there even, and I am very thankful to all of them. And about the sustainable development and the role of and the gender role, of course, we need the family responsive policies that are very important. Because I know there are so many girls in Pakistan who were very good like in research and in their education, even of course more good than me, and they could not continue their education because of non-responsive policies. And maybe if they come in the research, they may be able to do a better research and make a change. As Nancy told in her presentation, that women can play a role as an agent of change. So this is very important, I think so. Thank you very much.
I definitely agree. And I would just say that there are two sort of sides to this. There are the cultural expectations of women, not only by men, but by their families and by women themselves. And then there are also the specific government policies that make it easier for women to succeed. For instance, to have a delayed tenure clock if you're a professor after childbearing, to have, in some cases, different tracks for different kind of engagement in the scientific enterprise, to have allow women a longer time if they have children perhaps to reach the publications expectations. So there are lots of things that can be done. It's difficult, but it's possible.
Because all of these difficulties are there, so many girls are already being dropped out from even from PhD and from master's degrees because all of these difficulties they face. Yeah.
And it's important to start very young. I work actually with a Catholic girls' high school that's very close to the East-West Center. They're not totally, they have very, very, very strong science programs, and they actually start in preschool and go all the way through high school. And they're really outstanding, and they do excellent. So there are lots of things we can do. I'm optimistic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy, for a very interesting talk. I'm Elise Makarayan. I'm from the University of Queensland Center for Life Course Research in Australia, and also an incoming postdoc at Yale University. I think most of these people are high school students, right? Because I remember, this recalls me as well, when I was back in high school, I grew up in a rural area in the Philippines, where scientists rarely, I don't even remember any scientists going in our high school before, so I think this is a good opportunity for you guys. And every time I hear the word scientist, the first person that comes to my mind is Albert Einstein with all the hair scattered in here. It's like so nerdy, not so cool person, I think. So I love science, I love numbers back when I was a kid, but I've never imagined myself to be a scientist. So I guess my question is, how do you think we can motivate younger people to become scientists in the future? And also in doing so, how can we be, as future scientists or aspiring scientists, be good in actually doing science and motivating others to do it? So yeah.
Well, I will answer the question, but then I get to ask you a question. I think there are lots of ways that we can affect the teaching and learning process, and trying to make science exciting and not so nerdy, and trying to make science attractive to girls and not just sort of a very male-dominated sort of track. There's, I forget what it is, there's a whole big effort on getting girls to write computer code. It's I think it's international, it's certainly in the United States, and they do all these really creative things. So I think there are things we can do in the educational process to help change that image of the nerdy scientist, both for boys and for girls. And then you're a role model. I mean, I don't feel like a nerdy scientist. Now, but I get to ask you my question. How did you get into science?
Well, I'm still doing what I do, I guess. And everything, I think everything that we do, if we keep on doing what we love, is all about science. Everything that we see is science. And people don't see that automatically, that if you go into maths, if you go into engineering, if you love interviewing people, you can translate that into science and get evidence to actually change the world and into policies and practice. So, yeah, I think that's it. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, I open the floor to everyone. Now open the floor to everyone who has any questions or comments. Those young students, well, okay, I will just translate or summarize all the questions and answers, and because some of the answers I think they intended for high school students to understand. 那个刚刚有问一些问题，就是说，因为他们看到说有年轻的高中生进来听都非常的开心，就是说，因为我们在讲这个永续科学的时候，就是希望能够把这个永续发展的概念能够传播给那个下一代的年轻学子。那尤其是在问说，怎么样培养下一代的这个科学家。那当这个Nancy 的话也回答，就是说在教育的过程中，可以设计很多的不同的教育，然后来 encourage 大家去做，尤其是女性科学家可以 write computer code 啊，或者就是电脑的这些 coding 啊什么的，类似像这样子一些 training 都可以在教育系统中加入，然后可以让在很年轻的时候呢，就男性就是说不管是男生女生都有机会来接触到科学，然后 ultimately 就是 eventually 会 become 科学家。那尤其是Erling有讲说，他认为说，生活中到处都是科学，不管是数学啦、工程啊，或者是生活中的所有的一些大小琐事，如果你用科学的眼睛看它的话，它其实都是科学。所以即使他生长在一个非常乡下的地方，他从小到大从来没有看过真正的科学家进到他们的 classroom， 但是呢，他事实上他 eventually， 他最后还是选择科学这条路，因为他就是觉得这是非常非常自然，他的可以从科学家眼睛来看这个世界。OK， 大致上是他们刚刚一些 Q&A 的一些重点，我大概都稍微说一下。有没有任何大家有任何的 comment 或是 questions 或 suggestion？ Welcome。Okay, Carol.
Thanks for the informative talk, and you tackled several issues. I kind of want to go back to the Paris Agreement that you talked first. So you mentioned that the pledges are great, but then there's a lot more we can do. So one thing I can think of is, since this is a global thing, I'm thinking that we should probably involve more countries to join. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, like what are the incentives for those countries that have not joined?
Well, I'm not sure if I use these statistics. I think there are about 153 countries that have already joined, and that represents 95% of the emissions that have been, that we produce. But this is a highly politicized process, and a lot of it is sort of standard bearing, and it's very important. I mean, the fact that they did that is really exciting, but then when you calculate how each country has done it, and China has done it differently than the United States, and so I think it's not so much getting more countries to join, it's getting countries to live up to their pledge and do even better. And that's, there are no binding mechanisms for us to do this. This is all voluntary. And that's the only way we could have gotten the Paris Agreement. It was not going to pass if it was binding. But now it's international pressure to live up to your pledge and do better.
Thank you. 那最后一个问题的话，其实是问说，那个 Nancy 在 talk 中有提到说，去年底很重要的这个巴黎的这个协议，世界各国已经 sign 了一个，希望说能够世界维持在2°C 以内，然后朝向这个目标前进的这样的协议。那大概一共有153个国家参加。那Professor Zhuang 问的是说，怎么样让这些这个参与的国际，Nancy 是讲说重点是之后怎么样去执行。那庄老师的问题就是说，那 Nancy 要认为是怎么样，然后可以让这些国家去执行。Nancy 的回应是说，有153个国家参加，那最主要是说，到底这些国家是不是能够真正在国内 ，OK， 不是说，因为真正整个协议的签约其实是一个非常政治性的一个协议，一个宣示性的一个方式，它并没有真正，如果你没有达到的话，有什么样的法则，这个后续的一些后果。那真正要让大家能够在国内真正把这个政策落实的话，其实要靠一些国际上的一些压力。让大家知道说，如果说真的是超过2°C，或者是我们走向这个时代，像现在人一直在用这个化石燃料的话，我们可能会有更多的灾害，跟对健康的更多的这个伤害等等。要用很多的方式让国际上有这样子的压力持续存在，所以让各国不只是说在表面上sign了那个协议，而且是在各国实际上能够把它转化成政策，在实际上确实执行，而且各国会彼此监督自己，造成这样的压力。对，这是Nancy 最后的回答。好，那因为时间的关系，我相信如果有些because of the time limitation, I believe some of the audience wants to exchange ideas with Nancy in private. So I just conclude this session. Let's thank you, Nancy, again. Now we have 16 minutes of break. Okay. Our next session begins at 10:30. So we have 20 more something. So it's coffee break outside. Refreshments outside. Well, please enjoy yourself.